Welcome, everyone. Really happy to have you all today at the second of our Maddie's Insight webcast series, where we hear from experts in the fields of animals and animal welfare. And each session contains highlights of research results and actionable recommendations based on those results so that we can translate that research into the real life work that we're doing. I'm happy to introduce Dr. Frank McMillan, who served as the Director of Wellbeing Studies at Best Friends Animal Society from 2007 to 2020. In that role, his research involved the quality of life, mental health, and emotional well-being of animals who had endured hardship, adversity, and psychological trauma. He's published in scientific journals the first studies of dogs, research on dogs rescued from puppy mills, hoarding situations, and abusive environments. And that work has also included the psychological health of puppies born and sold through pet stores or over the internet. Before joining Best Friends, he was in private practice for 23 years, as well as a clinical professor of medicine at the Western University of Health Sciences College of Veterinary Medicine. He's board certified in the veterinary specialties of small animal internal medicine and animal welfare. He lectures worldwide and is the author of the textbook Mental Health and Wellbeing in Animals. It's now on its second edition. It's a book I highly recommend. If you don't have it, I encourage you to add it to your library. And he's also the author of a book for the general public titled Unlocking the Animal Mind. Welcome, Dr. McMillan. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sheila. Welcome, everybody, to this presentation. I'm thrilled that you have an interest in this, and I hope after seeing this, you'll even have more of an interest, because it's an important topic, and it's just starting to get the attention that it deserves, and I'm proud to be able to share some of this knowledge with you. All right, so let's get started here. This is just a quote by an American physiologist, which basically sums up what I'm going to be presenting today. And that is, a sense of separation is a condition that makes being a mammal so painful. And by the end of the talk, you'll see just exactly what that means. Okay, so just to get us started here. Oh, by the way, I should mention, if I talk fast, don't worry, everything's on the slides. And if not, you can always ask me in questions afterwards or online. Anyway, okay, so let's start at the very basics here. The natural forces of attraction in nature. You all know from high school physics that there's three major forms of attraction: gravity, electromagnetism, nuclear forces. But what I want to present is the equivalent in biology, which is the social attractions that draw individuals together. So this little graphic that I have here of the two individuals with magnets, the whole talk is going to be on how that works and why it's so important for dogs. Okay, so why did social behavior evolve? Not all animals are social animals. So for the ones that did evolve to become social, there's got to be a benefit for that. And it turns out there's actually quite a few benefits. Sociality or social connectedness is very adaptive in terms of group living. The benefits being safety, obviously just safety in numbers, parental care. When you're in a group, you can actually share parental care and makes it a lot easier than the burden being on one individual parent. Food acquisition, that's pretty obvious, because if the other members of your group are out hunting, they can bring back food that you can share in, and vice versa, so that everything that you eat isn't up to you to catch and kill. And then mate procurement, that goes almost without speaking, that that if you're in a group, the potential mates you have are right there with you, as opposed to going out and looking for them. So for social animals, being socially separated for all the reasons I just mentioned, greatly increases the chances of starvation and predation death. And whenever there's a force like that working that harms animals and causes death, natural selection selects strongly against that. So what's happened for social animals is that the selection pressure favored those who are very motivated to be and maintain social connectedness with others. And those without the mechanisms in their brain to keep them in connection with others are the ones that die off, and those genes obviously don't get passed on. The other area where the benefits of social behavior and actions are seen, we don't have time to talk about, but it's health and longevity. And I'll just briefly mention that studies in animals and many in humans show that social interactions are beneficial for health and longevity. If an individual person, for example, lives a very solitary life, their chances of health problems and a shorter life are much higher than with a lot of friends and family and social connections. All right, so evolutionarily then, how did this all come about? And there's only a few possibilities to motivate social togetherness. And these come from the very basic of learning theory, reward and punishment. As far as the reward aspect of it, that is where pleasant feelings are generated internally to reward physical closeness. In other words, make it feel good to be together with others like yourself. And the punishment, obviously, is just the opposite, and that is to generate unpleasant feelings internally to punish physical separation. In other words, make it painful to be apart. So just real briefly here, on the good side of making it feel good to be together, the evidence that's been derived is that social affiliation and attachment activates reward mechanisms in the brain, and that generates a number of different kinds of pleasant feelings. One is just pure pleasure, joy, feeling good in general. The other is a sense of comfort, being around others. And then a sense of security, again, safety in numbers. You feel a lot safer when you're around others. And that's those are three emotional benefits of being and staying with others in social affiliations. What we want to focus on today, though, is the punishment aspect, not because I like punishment, but because that's the whole point of social pain. And that is make it painful to be apart. And that is what we call social pain. So what is this thing called social pain? Well, first of all, it's a sort of a subcategory of emotional pain. Emotional pain covers a lot of different emotions that are just painful, unpleasant to feel. And that includes fear and guilt and a whole bunch of different things, anxiety, boredom, all that kind of a thing. But social pain is a subcategory within emotional pain. And social pain is actually a group of emotions or feelings, not just a single one, but it includes all these: loneliness, insecurity, fear, jealousy, resentment, anger, sense of loss. And sometimes they work together. So for example, as you'll see in terms of like jealousy and anger can go together very easily, especially in humans, and other things, fear and loneliness and insecurity, all can be combined. So this as a group is what we're talking about when we talk about social pain. And social pain is basic to all mammal brains that have been studied. Again, us being just one of the many social animals that we're talking about today. So social pain evolved as an alarm signal that one's connections to others are weakening or lost. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, it means that if you have social connections with others or a single other, if you're in, for example, a loving relationship, and you start to sense that the bonds are weakening, for example, in a typical spousal relationship, if you start to sense that your spouse is losing their love for you, or even going farther to stray and cheat on you. Those unpleasant feelings that go off in your brain are the alarm signal that that bond is weakening and that it needs to be corrected. The unpleasantness of the feelings that are generated is how nature motivates us to repair and maintain those social connections. So at first you're alerted to the bonds are weakening. Secondly, you're motivated then to get to work and start to mend those broken bonds. So as a definition then, social pain can be defined as the unpleasant emotional experience arising from the perception that social relationships are threatened, damaged, or lost. Okay, so the causes then of social pain, you can pretty much guess these ahead of time by just the different types of emotions I mentioned are involved. The first one is simply being isolated from social interactions with others. So we can look at basically all the different types of social species and how they can be isolated. Dogs kept in cages by themselves, horses kept in single stalls, which sadly is the way so many of them are housed. And then humans in solitary confinement in jail. All of those are preventing social interactions, and that's what signals in your brain to fix that problem. And the unpleasantness then is to motivate you to do just that. The second type of cause is being rejected or excluded or ostracized from a valued social group. So if you're in a group of friends and they start to do things without your participation, that uneasiness and even more anxiety starts to develop as a signal to you that you're being excluded from that social group. And you, therefore, will do things to try to mend those bonds and get back with the group. And we'll see how this works in animals, because it's a fascinating thing that goes on in nature with this kind of process. The third is unwanted separation from a social companion. And the easiest one to imagine is in humans when you're in a loving relationship and your partner decides to end the relationship. And that is something that, needless to say, causes great pain. And that is a form of social pain, is being rejected from a loving relationship. And then finally, the death of a valued social companion. This is where the bond is not just threatened, but it's destroyed, and unfortunately is not going to be regained no matter how unpleasant the feelings of grief are. But it's to alert you that you've lost a social relationship. It's actually interesting to speculate why grief evolved, because it seems like there would be no benefit to motivating you to reestablish a bond that's permanently gone. So what it's believed by evolutionary biologists is that that grief is to motivate you to establish new bonds with others to make up for the one that's lost. So it works in a number of different ways. So as I mentioned, this works in nature, and it's fascinating how this works. If you look at troops of chimpanzees or herds of horses, these obviously being very social animals, what happens is if one of the group members starts to misbehave, violate social norms, in other words, be overly aggressive or antagonistic or not following just typical normal rules, the group will actually ostracize that individual. And by being cast outside of the group, there is a very strong motivation for that individual to now behave to be allowed back into the group. So they'll show deference to the group members, they'll show submissive signs, and then they'll show good behavior to be allowed back in the group, because the unpleasantness of being ostracized by the group is a strong motivator. All right, so I just want to mention one thing briefly here, and that's that we're very familiar with the emotional feelings of social separation. Again, in different types of feelings, but overall, if you're separated, there's an unpleasant group of feelings. Okay, so those are emotional feelings. But what I want to mention briefly here is new evidence pointing towards physical feelings associated with these kinds of emotional bond breakings. Okay, here's 4 studies that were published fairly recently, all looking at a very similar process. And what they found is that loneliness and social isolation in humans actually has a sensation of cold. The person feels cold, the person measures cold on body temperature, and this is something that's very exciting. The reason I find it so interesting is that although this hasn't been studied in animals, if it pans out to where animals that are feeling social isolation and social pain do have things like a lower body temperature, we would have a marker that we now lack in terms of diagnosing certain kinds of emotional upsets that animals go through. So, for example, if a dog left home all day and we were worried that that dog feels socially isolated when they're left alone, if there were something that could be measured, like body temperature, that would be pretty exciting to see. One study that I had semi-designed, but then I left Best Friends before I could do it, was to put dogs into a room where one side of the room was warm and the other side of the room was colder, and to watch how the dogs behave. Because if they seek warmth, that would follow the human studies here that they are feeling lonely and therefore physically feeling cold. So these are exciting things. And again, all the help we can use in diagnosing emotional conditions in animals would be a huge help. All right, so let's shift gears a little bit here. And what I want to do now is compare physical pain with emotional pain. Again, social pain being one type of emotional pain. And to illustrate this, on the first slide, I just put two photos, one of them obvious, one not so. On the left is a dog that was hit by a car. And if you have any training in radiology, you can see multiple pelvic fractures and a fracture of the left thigh bone there. And that, of course, is to illustrate obvious physical pain. On the right side is one of the rare photos I have of emotional pain. It's very hard to picture emotional pain, and this is true even in children. There's just no good way that you can photograph emotional pain. But this is one that is a still photo taken from a video we shot in the back of a dog auction. And the dog auctions are where dogs are people that run breeding facilities that we often call puppy mills. They come and sell and buy dogs for their breeding facilities. And in the back of the barn area where their dogs are held before they're taken out to the auction block, this is what we're looking at here, the dogs being kept in the back. And obviously what you can see here, these are two female breeding dogs. The one on the lower part of the picture there, anybody, even without dog knowledge, can pretty much tell she's terrified. But that's not the really heartbreaking one. The one that actually made me tear up was, the image was the female behind her with her head pressed into the corner. That is just a scream for help to get this all to stop because it's so terrifying. Okay, so the first question then, if we compare social and physical pain, is social pain real pain? And the reason this question comes up in humans and animals is that we use a lot of the same language for social pain that we do for physical pain. For example, a broken heart, hurt feelings, all those things are descriptive of physical pain, but a broken heart obviously describes something quite different. So all these metaphors, are they real metaphor? I'm sorry, do they mean something real, or are they just pure metaphors? Well, recent research in the neuroscience fields has revealed that unpleasant social emotions or social pain are a form of actual pain. And there's 3 lines of evidence that show this, and I'll go through them individually in a sec. First, shared brain mechanisms between physical and social pain, shared sensitivities to physical and social pain, and a crossover of treatment between the 2 types of pain. So first, shared neuroanatomy and neurophysiological mechanisms. What's been found in human studies and animal, which I'll get to in a second, is that the same brain regions where physical pain is processed are activated in social pain episodes. And this particular study that I've got here was just one of the typical types that looked at this. And what this did, or what this study did, is they had people lay down in a functional MRI so they could scan and see which brain centers would become active under certain stimulation. And then while the people were laying there, they had them hooked up to where they could play a computer game. And the computer game was a game of little stickman volleyball where you would be playing against another player. And in this, the way they set it up, you'd be playing against two different other players. And what the experiment then did is it started to slowly have the other players not toss the ball to you as the one who was sitting there being the one in the experiment. And you would then start to feel rejection from these other two players who were choosing to not involve you anymore. And that would elicit the social pain of exclusion. And then they would see the brain centers light up. And what they found in the human studies is that the centers lighting up were the same centers that light up when physical pain was elicited. So again, shared mechanisms there between the two different forms of pain. In animals, the experiments are the kind I don't like or condone, but they're the experimental types. And what they did with animals is two different manipulations of the physical pain processing centers of the brain. And in one, they would stimulate it with an electrode that was inserted into the brain. So they were stimulating the pain centers. And what they found is that that would then make the animal behave as if the social pain centers were being stimulated. So, for example, if they stimulated the physical pain center in the animal then would seek more social companionship than they would under normal circumstances because the social pain centers were now being stimulated. Now, conversely, the other way this has been studied is where the physical pain centers would be surgically removed from the brain, and then they would study how the animals behaved socially. And what they found is that when those pain centers were removed, the animals would no longer seek social companionship. In other words, they showed no need for human companionship because no social pain was being elicited. So interesting studies showing, again, the pain centers in the brain are shared between social and physical. Here's where we can see another line of evidence where shared sensitivities to both types of pain showed up. And in this particular study, the experimenters did the same type of experiment that I just showed or just talked about in the previous one, where they would put them in under a scanner and then induce a type of rejection of social pain, and then study what was happening. But what I forgot to mention is that first they studied what these people physical pain, what their how sensitive they were to physical pain. And the way they did that was real simple. They hooked up their finger to an electric shock and started very mild and turned it slowly up until they said to the person, tell us when you can't tolerate it anymore. And that way they could find people that were very able to accept pain and those who were very sensitive and couldn't. And then what they found when they combined the two different experiments, the social pain induction and the physical pain, is that the same people that were very sensitive to physical pain, in other words, they could not tolerate it very well, were also more sensitive to the pain of social rejection. In other words, they couldn't tolerate it even at the lowest, earliest levels. So the sensitivities then were shared between these types of pain. And the third line of evidence is also very interesting, and that is that different methods that alleviate one form of pain can have an effect on alleviating the other. So the first one here is social support, which pretty much by definition alleviates social pain. In other words, you're giving social support to a dog, for example, that's denied human companionship. That basically replaces what's lost, and so the social pain goes away. But the studies have shown in both humans and animals that social support can also alleviate physical pain. In humans, it's extensive. It can be anything from back pain to the pain of heart attacks, recovery. Just a wide array of different types of pain can be eased with social support. And in dogs, the way they studied it is they would put the dog's paw on a hot plate and just very, very slowly increase the temperature to where they could tell the dog obviously couldn't tolerate it because he would lift his paw. And then they would find that when that dog was accompanied by a human, they were much more tolerant of the heat as it rose, and it therefore was showing alleviation of that type of pain in the dog's mind. And then finally, pharmacologic treatments have lately, in recent studies in humans, been shown to cross over somewhat. This is a study that was done with acetaminophen or Tylenol. And what these researchers did is they studied the effect of Tylenol, which, as we know, is used to relieve physical pain, and see what its effect on social pain was. And the way this was done is they gave half of the people acetaminophen tablets, half of the people placebo tablets, and then sent them home. And over the next 2 weeks, asked the people to record any incidences of social pain that they experienced. That could be social rejection, it could be loneliness, all the things we've already talked about. Then they brought all the people back to the laboratory and studied the notebooks that the people had made entries in. And what they found was that the people that were taking the active acetaminophen made a lot fewer entries of the social pain episodes in their notebooks than the people that did not receive acetaminophen, that were receiving placebo. So in some way, the acetaminophen was alleviating social pain just in a similar way as it alleviates physical pain. Now, quick mention here, this hasn't been studied in animals, and by no means do I want anybody to take this and apply it to animals. Because number one, we don't know if it works. Number two, we don't know if it's safe because, as many of you probably know, acetaminophen, for example, can be very toxic in certain species like cats. So this is just exciting things to look ahead to. But unfortunately, we don't have ways to medicate dogs out of loneliness at this point in time. Okay, so moving on again, kind of quickly, physical versus emotional pain, which hurts more? Okay, we just talked about how they compare in terms of how the brain processes them, but let's talk about this. Which one of these hurts more? Okay, let me start off with just eliciting a stress response. If we look at the different types of elicitors of the stress response, there are the physical types: heat, cold, pain, disease, itchiness, electric shock, that kind of thing. And then there's the psychological, which are anxiety, fear, conflict, social isolation, lack of control, unpredictability, all those kinds of things. And what the studies over the many years that these have been looked at have shown is that the most potent elicitor of the stress response are the psychological stimuli, not the physical. So if we're going to start answering our question of which of the two hurt more, we can start off with which one elicits a stress response more powerfully. And it is the emotional type of factors. But it has been looked at experimentally too. And in this particular study here, what the researchers did was they separated puppies from the people that they had bonded to by an electric grid. And so what would happen here is the puppy, the only way to rejoin and connect with that human that they're bonded to would be to walk across an electric grid that caused physical pain. And so obviously what this experiment did is force the puppy to choose, are you more willing to endure the physical pain or the social pain of being separated from your bonded companion? And what the researchers found is that the puppies would walk across the electric grid willing to endure the physical shocks because, as this tells us, they were more willing to endure that than the social pain of being separated. A similar phenomenon was seen in this study, which separated infant rats from their mothers. And they placed the infants on one side of an electric grid and the mothers on the other. And I should mention here that studies have shown that both in humans and animals, if a mother hears their infant baby cry in any kind of distress call or anything, that actually elicits brain centers in the mother that are distress circuits. And so if you are listening to this, are a mother of infants and felt distress when you thought your infant was suffering, that wasn't your imagination or some weird thing. That was your brain being hardwired to elicit distress in you. And again, as a motivator to fix the problem. Okay, so what happened here? The mothers would hear their infants cry from the other side of an electric grid and would have to choose, are they going to sit here and endure listening to their infants squeal or endure the physical shocks? And not only did the mother rats walk across the electric grid to get their babies, they endured the shock of carrying the babies back to the nest where they could feel they were putting their babies in a safe environment. So this here again is a pitting of emotional versus physical pain and showing which ones the animals were more willing to endure because the other one was more painful. Now, a similar process showed itself in the natural world, so to speak. You may have seen this study. It's actually been several years ago now, but what happened is that in Brooklyn, New York, an abandoned building caught fire. And when the firefighters arrived, they were able to observe, although they couldn't get to the area, they were able to observe this mother cat walk into this flaming building and retrieve her kittens one by one till she had all 5 kittens out of the building. And during the process of retrieving the kittens, she suffered burns that were so severe they burned off the tips of her ears. They made her eyes swollen shut. Her whole face was red, which is how she got the name Scarlet when she went to the local shelter. But the pain that had to be endured is unimaginable to us as humans, that we would go into a fire and endure that kind of pain just to alleviate, in this case, the distress of hearing her kittens crying in this building. So again, when you ask the question, which one hurts more, physical or emotional pain, I like to say here that Scarlett answered that question 5 times and in a very dramatic way. If you saw this story, you also may know that Scarlett got applications for being adopted from around the world. They received about 10,000 applications, and she was famous around the world for having done what she did. And so famous, in fact, that when she died a few years later, she also made the news just because of her history of being such a heroic mother. Okay, here's another comparison of a physical type of pain, not actual pain, but a physical type of pain of hunger. And this is where the experimenters took companion capuchin monkeys. These are companions that live together. They were friends. And they separated them. And then the monkeys had a choice of either being reconnected with their social companion or getting food, but they couldn't get both. And what they found, it's a small study, but they found that most of the monkeys chose to be reconnected with their social companion over food, even after lengthy periods that would cause pretty significant hunger, and therefore choosing to endure the hunger rather than being separated from their companion. Here's a study that I wanted to point out in humans that is really it really tells us a lot about how emotional and physical pain compare. This is a study in 1981 where the researchers compared the effects in children of emotional neglect alone, and it compared that to emotional neglect accompanied by physical abuse. And they wanted to know which one was more harmful. And what it turns out, against all odds, so to speak, is that emotional neglect alone actually causes greater harm to a child in the long run than emotional neglect with physical abuse. And the researchers speculated here that the attention provided by the physical abuse, even though it's unpleasant and negative, had enough of a positive effect, which makes the overall experience better than being emotionally deprived alone. So that's how powerful of a punisher emotional neglect is that the child is willing to endure physical abuse and will suffer fewer consequences that way. This is commonly seen in when you hear descriptions of teenagers who misbehave to get the attention of their parents. So even though they're punished, at least they're getting that attention. And that's how bad social deprivation is that it makes you even seek harmful things just to get that attention. One other illustration of how bad emotional pain is, it's used as torture. Here's two textbooks I have on my shelf. Not pleasant, but they show you what we're talking about here. In the first one, I chose a passage here to illustrate this. It has become obvious that the main objective of torture is not to inflict physical wounds or injuries. On the contrary, the objective is to leave psychological wounds. Indeed, even the real purpose of physical torture, which does bear physical scars, is to have a major impact on the long-term psyche of an individual. And then in the second book here, in a list of the categories of psychological torture, number one is social isolation. That's how much of a punisher it is. And in fact, there have been lawsuits with people in solitary confinement in jails here in the U.S. That the punishment is cruel and unusual because of the severity of what social isolation does. Okay, so let's look then at dogs. Obviously, that's where these things really key in. First, an obvious thing, dogs are social species, so they do have a strong need for social companionship. By the way, everything I say here is in general. We all know that some dogs don't have a need or desire for canine companionship, but as a whole, as a species, they are very social and desire canine companionship. So attachment with humans, then, it's been widely accepted that one of the most important effects of the domestication of the dog has been a strengthening of their attachment to humans. And a little cartoon kind of illustrates that. Here's one study that was looking at this, and this is where it was studied whether dog and wolf puppies would form with socialization attachments to humans in the same way. And what they found is that even after extensive socialization, wolf puppies do not show patterns of attachment to humans comparable to those observed in pet dogs. And the conclusion, dogs appear to have evolved a capacity for attachment to humans that is much greater than that found in wolves and functionally analogous to that present in human infants towards their mothers. So again, when you look again at how things have changed in nature, this is a comparison of what dogs were at one point in the long past, wolves, and then the wolves now. Actually, I should be specific, ancestors of wolves, not actual wolves. Here's some more studies looking at this. In a study out of Italy, they studied the propensity with which dogs in shelters form attachments with people. And they found that dogs show, quote, a remarkable readiness to form attachment relationships. And the results suggest that dogs living in rescue centers have a high need for social contact with humans, and that this need can lead to a rapid formation of attachment to an attachment figure. Similar study here, responses of shelter and pet dogs to an unknown human. And here's where they compared pet dogs in homes with dogs in animal shelters. And they found that shelter dogs showed a higher frequency of proximity seeking to an unfamiliar person than pet dogs did, suggesting that dogs with diminished human contact, those in shelters, are willing and able to quickly initiate a social relationship with humans. Okay, so the evidence supports that domestication strengthened the social attachment with humans, and it's now generally accepted that the dog's need for human companionship is at least equal to their need for fellow canine companionship, but we now know even more. The current evidence now suggests that the strength of the dog-to-human bond has actually surpassed that of the dog-to-dog bond. Here's a couple or a few quotes from experts in the field. Dogs prefer humans over conspecifics as social partners. The most important social interaction for dogs is human contact rather than contact with conspecifics. And dogs' attachment to people is often more intense than attachment to individuals of their own species. That's just them speaking, but there is the science here. And this is where studies have looked at how dogs and wolf puppies compare. Given a choice between canine and human companionship, dog puppies would choose the human over canine companionship, but the wolf puppies would choose the opposite. They would choose canine companionship over wolves. So again, this shows the comparison that the attachment towards a human seems to have surpassed that of fellow canines. Several other studies looked at this in different ways. Dogs showed more contact-seeking behavior towards an unfamiliar human than toward a housemate dog. These are dogs they live with in their own home, but they would actually seek contact more with an unfamiliar human than their own buddies that they live with. Dogs in solitary housing showed a high stress level, and these stress levels were lowered when they had a 90-minute walk per day with humans. But those stress levels did not go down when these dogs were simply put in cages or enclosures with other dogs. So in other words, the human companionship would lower their stress levels of isolation, but fellow dog companionship did not. So the need for the human companionship is both different and greater than that for fellow dogs. And then finally, when they measured physiologic stress levels in dogs, those levels were alleviated in the presence of a familiar human, but not in the presence of a familiar canine companion. So all of these show a comparison of how dogs react in bonding towards people and how much more they seek that than dog companionship. Okay, so this is going back to the human researchers. They made a comment regarding humans, which very much applies to dogs, and that is this. Evolution's solution to ensured nurturance might have unintentionally produced a lifelong need for social connection and a corresponding sense of distress when social connections are broken. And the current evidence suggests that this development was greatly amplified in the domestic dog. So if we go back to our original question of how are these bonds created, how did evolution create the social glue that keeps individuals together? And we can see that the way evolution through domestication would strengthen this is by strengthening both sides of the equation, make the reward bigger and therefore intensify the pleasurable feelings for being socially connected, make it feel better to be together, and then also make the punishment worse, intensify the unpleasurable feelings for being socially separated, make it even more painful to be apart. And so because of this, my view is that the uniqueness of canine social pain is that it probably is, as a result of domestication, the most intense social pain of all animals, including humans. The reason I say that is that no other species, including humans, has had the manipulation of those emotions in the same way to where they were amplified over time, and therefore the good feelings feeling better, the bad feelings feeling worse. Okay, so that gives us enough time then to look at the applications of how this all applies to behavior problems in dogs. This is an area that's been gotten relatively poor attention up until recently. And what I mean here is that correcting behavior problems, addressing just simply the behavior versus the emotional underlying elements. Recently, though, things have started to turn, thank goodness. This is one paper by Daniel Mills, who is writing on the emotional behavior related to behavior problems. Just to illustrate briefly that some attention is now being given to this important concept. To illustrate some of the types of forms, you can actually think of these yourself, but of course, separation anxiety is the one that stands out foremost as far as an emotional pain that elicits a behavior problem. Okay, this what I have here on the screen here is a photo and an email that a woman sent to me. She was the owner of a dog in one of our studies of psychological trauma in dogs. And this is what her email said. It was 2 years ago today that Josie came to live with us. I had to share the picture of what I came home to one day after being gone for about 1 hour. The chair that's in front of the TV is usually where I'm standing to take the photo. And yes, that's her you see in the bottom of the picture. Let's just say it's been an eventful 2 years, LOL. Now, I love this because any owner who can LOL this kind of a situation is the kind of owner I want all dogs to have. This is, I just love this. Okay, so what's happening then in the social pain involved with separation anxiety is that the unpleasant feelings are kicking in at a very high degree, but it is not mainly just a loneliness feeling that they're feeling. They have this component, the insecurity and fear that goes out of control. And this is why dogs just tear everything up and try to escape because it's terrifying to them. It's not just loneliness, it's an absolute terror. And therefore, separation anxiety, again, being one of the best illustrations of emotional pain and specifically social pain, eliciting behavior problems. Now, this is just a very recently published paper that talks about another type of social pain in dogs, and that's grief over the loss of a conspecific. This study showed that there is distinctive behavior associated with dogs when they lose a companion. There is a little bit of a hazy area in this study in that the researchers admit that some of the behavior may be due to the owner's emotional status of the loss of the dog, the fellow dog. But it's still very distinctive in the fact that the dogs show this kind of behavior with the loss of a canine companion. All right, so what are the priorities in resolving problem behavior caused by emotional pain? Well, first of all, undesired behavior is frequently, but not always, caused by emotional pain. So I put two here overlapping circles. One is on the left, the undesired behavior where treatment is sought. And then on the right side, emotional pain. And there's an overlap there where emotional pain underlies the undesired behavior and treatment sought. So some examples of that, for example, are barking from loneliness, dogs tied out back, for example, left with no companionship. Destruction from separation anxiety, like we just saw. And then fearful aggression. That's also an underlying emotional pain that elicits an undesired behavior where treatment is sought. Okay, that's all fairly straightforward. But here's where it gets a little tricky, and that is there is undesired behavior treatment sought that's unrelated to emotional pain. For example, dogs that just chew on the owner's shoes and destroy things in that way. They just like the chewing. And then male sexual mounting. Again, not out of a social pain, but just out of a desire. And then there's emotional pain that's not connected then to undesired behavior where treatment is sought. And this comes in the form of such things as what we call quiet separation anxiety, where they don't go ballistic and cause destruction and defecation and all that kind of thing. And they just suffer in silence. Loneliness, very hard to detect. As I mentioned, we'd love to have some physical monitor like a body temperature fluctuation. And then digging in the backyard or garden from boredom. Okay, the reason I put this down is it might not be for undesired behavior treatment sought, is that some people have a backyard that's so huge that the dog digging excessively to alleviate their boredom doesn't bother the owner. So there's no undesired behavior from their point of view, and therefore no treatment sought. Okay, so again, mostly an overlap, but not always. So for the ones that overlap then, the treatment involves two priorities. One is the alleviation of emotional pain, and the other is modification of the behavior, okay? And unfortunately, they don't always go hand in hand. What I mean by that is that we can focus too much on the behavior. In other words, just trying to correct the behavior. When the motivation for an unwanted behavior is an unpleasant feeling, such as fear, anxiety, separation, distress, loneliness, boredom, then punishing or blocking the behavior may stop the behavior, but any untreated underlying emotional distress will allow the suffering to continue and possibly worsen. Classic example here is the anti-bark collars that either elicit an electric shock or a citronella spray when they pick up on the dog barking. You can actually get a dog to stop barking. But if they're barking out of intense loneliness and social isolation, you obviously haven't helped the dog at all in terms of their emotional suffering. This is a passage from a book written by a human researcher that looks basically at animal and human welfare. And the quote is about people, but it applies to animals. When we care about a suffering person or a person in pain, we're not really interested in this person's behavior. Our aim is not to eradicate the behavior. Instead, our aim is to eradicate the awful thing that elicits the behavior. And this is finally coming over to the veterinary side. This is out of a feline textbook here, where there's a little passage here. When clinicians are faced with a pet cat with a behavior problem, it's important to understand that simply modifying the unwanted behavior without addressing the underlying emotional motivation is like treating a medical symptom without investigating the underlying disease state. Okay, but if we focus too much on the emotional pain, if we put our priority there, which the priority should be there, but if we focus too much on it, there are certain cases where it may not address the pet owner's concern fully or quickly enough. For example, when I was in practice, I had a number of animals that were causing such problems, whether it be, for example, aggression towards children or destruction of the household, that kind of a thing, that I may not be able to convince the owner that we should work on emotional pain, and after a few months, we'll be able to get that corrected. The dog's biting children, can't do that. So sometimes you have to actually not bypass the emotional pain, but get immediately to the behavior and work on the emotional pain on a sort of a secondary level, still addressing it, but not as the first priority. Okay, and that brings us to the last slide, which I'm going to just run through quickly here. The implications of social pain for dogs are huge. One is, of course, housing. How do we house dogs in terms of having the companionship they need? We don't tie them out back and leave them in the yard with no social companionship, preferably with canine companionship. But again, canine companionship not being a full replacement for human companionship. So there's a lot of implications with how we house dogs. Second, what constitutes abuse and neglect? Actions and inactions causing emotional pain are just as bad as those causing physical pain. So if you look at all the state laws regarding abuse and neglect of animals, they virtually all focus on physical type of abuse and physical type of neglect, like not giving adequate water and shelter. But the emotional pains and sufferings from that are just as bad. So we need to make sure that neglect and abuse include emotional neglect and emotional abuse. Training and discipline, you always see this admonition of no physical punishment. I shouldn't say always, but you sometimes see this no physical punishment. You'll see it in some training books today and books that are on the shelf today. And although I certainly agree with no physical punishment, I hate the fact that physical is put in there because it tends to isolate physical punishment as the thing that we don't want to do. When in fact, emotional punishment, as I illustrated a number of ways through this talk, can be just as punishing or worse. So rejection or isolation by putting a dog in the garage, those things can be just as damaging to the dog, and therefore admonishing people to not physically punish their dog, great, but don't emotionally punish your dog either. Emotional pain may involve health and obesity issues. Let me just say we didn't have time to cover it, but animals can suffer ill health with emotional pain and also overeat to alleviate emotional pain the same way people do to alleviate stress and anxiety. Domestic dogs' enhanced potential to experience social pain should be approached as would be expected for caring for an animal with enhanced sensitivity to physical pain. I say that both on the breed level, meaning that dogs as a breed being more sensitive to social pain, we need to pay attention to that. But also within the dogs, individual dogs, some are going to be more sensitive to both physical and social pain, and we should tend to those dogs accordingly, and gear the way we care for them in that way. And finally, breeding for human bonding. It's basically done a tremendously huge, great job for creating a man's best friend, but it also, by enhancing the emotions, as we saw, it has a flip side, and that is that their ability to suffer is enhanced, and therefore we need to pay very close attention to what we literally have created in dogs. This is a paper that covers all of that and much more. It's been a few years now, 2016. But if anybody wants a copy of the paper, just email me. That's my email there at the bottom. And again, this is the illustration that I wanted to show throughout the talk, and that is how individuals are drawn together and kept together. And I think you can see now how that works. And that brings us to the end. And a shameless plug for my book. My email there is, again, at the bottom. So any questions you might have, obviously feel free to email me. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Sheila.
Thank you so much, Dr. McMillan. There's so much here, and thanks for sharing everything that you've learned about this topic. I'll never forget the day when I did a literature search to look for scientific evidence regarding trauma in animals, and for whatever reason, I hadn't come across this paper, and I wanted to support my personal experiences working with animals who are recovering from trauma. And coming across this paper, which just lays everything out so clearly regarding the detrimental effects of emotional pain and the beneficial effects of social connection. The work you've done has really paved the way and provided scientific evidence to support the changes we're recommending and making in animal welfare. And I'm extremely grateful to you because of that. When I talk about why preventing intake into shelter environments and preferentially housing pets in foster care while they wait for a new home is so important, there's really no bigger and better argument in my mind than the importance of reducing social pain. So on behalf of everyone here today and those who will be watching this webcast on demand, thank you. Thank you so much. We have a couple of questions because we're coming up on the hour. I want to tell everybody that the questions that we won't be able to get to will be posted into Maddie's pet forum, and we will be answering them there. But we will get to a couple of them. The first question is from Suzanne, who says, thank you for all of this. Wondering that because social pain hurts more, then do we risk inadvertently pressuring and possibly hurting a dog when we use our relationship with them to force them past their comfort zone, as might happen when the dog is afraid of environmental stimuli, but we insist that they remain with us?
Suzanne, that's such a great question because I dealt with that so much. And of course, we didn't have time to talk about it, but there is a very difficult area in terms of helping animals overcome their emotional problems, like fear, by inducing a degree of fear. And by the way, this is the same problem with people, in children and even in adults. Getting them exposed to unpleasantness, but in a safe environment where they can deal with it better, is the only way to get them over the hump, so to speak. And we saw this, and we still do, in rescued puppy mill dogs, particularly, who are terrified of humans. If you allow the dog in an adoptive household to just seek their own place, they will very often stay under the bed forever. And the only way to get them to be able to overcome their fear is to induce a little bit of it. And I so much hate saying that because I don't want to cause fear to any animal, but it is just like, again, in people with all kinds of disorders, PTSD, perfect example, the low-grade exposure to what is threatening to them is really the only way to let them deal with it and see that it is safe to interact with. So such a great question. Thanks so much for asking it. I wish I had the answer as to how do you balance how much of that that you inflict on them, and there is no answer. It's done basically on good common sense, knowing that the animal, you read the animal to know that they're able to deal with the situation in very gradual increments. But it does do what you said, and that is it does expose them to a little bit of the fear, and it's the only way to ultimately overcome the major factor.
Thank you. Next question is, in California and many other states, I assume, a dog who bites and breaks skin must go into quarantine for 10 days. My shelter follows this quarantine rules quite strictly. But given the enforced separation, isn't the quarantine likely to exacerbate behavioral problems in many dogs? If so, wouldn't it be better to find some way to allow safe interaction between dogs in quarantine and humans?
Yeah, that's also a good question, because there is certainly potential of taking dogs and putting them in isolation and creating new emotional upsets for them. But there's also the simple human factor of, or I should say, risk of the human factor of injury. And therefore, the laws are written very strictly in terms of, just keep this dog away from people for a certain amount of time. Now, there's been no studies that look at what you're asking, and that is, would they do better in an environment that was more supportive emotionally compared to an environment where they're in strict isolation? My suspicion is that in the long run, that degree of isolation wouldn't be long enough to really cause major problems. I'll tell you where it does, and you may be aware of this, and that is when there are busts done on dogfighting rings, and the dogs are then taken in and kept in shelters for God knows how long, months, sometimes years, waiting for court trials. And these are dogs that are bred to be very attached to humans. That's how they're driven to fight in the ring, is that they're trying to please their human handler. The problem is that everybody gets, not everybody, I shouldn't say that. So many people are afraid of interacting with these dogs that they're left alone and suffer dramatically in that time period. So that's something that needs to be fixed and quite changed. But in the meantime, again, the short types of isolations, I don't think would be too harmful any more than they would be for a person kept in isolation for 2 weeks, let's say, or 10 days. You wouldn't like it, it'd be uncomfortable, but you'd come out and not be that much worse off for it.
Thank you, Dr. McMillan. We have lots more questions and some really good ones, but unfortunately we are out of time. So we will be posting these questions in Maddie's Pet Forum, where Dr. McMillan will be answering them for us. Thank you, Dr. McMillan, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Take care. Bye.